Now add money when fear becomes profitable. In video 1, we talked about the loop. In video 2, we added security. I feel threatened, so I protect myself. You see me protecting myself, and now you feel threatened, so you protect yourself. I see you protecting yourself, and now I feel even more justified to protect myself even more. And around we go. But now we're going to add something else, money. Because what happens when somebody starts making money? Every time the loop goes around, that's when the loop becomes much harder to stop. But first, this does not require a conspiracy. That's important. When somebody says people are profiting from this problem, it's easy to hear somebody secretly created the problem so they could make money. Those are two completely different claims. You don't have to create a problem to benefit from it. You don't even have to want the problem to exist. You can simply become economically dependent upon the conditions that problem creates. Imagine a community has a serious crime problem. Someone opens a security company. Is a security company automatically bad? Of course not. They're solving a legitimate problem. They hire employees. Those employees support families. Customers receive protection. The owner earns a profit. Everybody involved may have perfectly reasonable intentions. But why though? Why does that company have customers? Because people feel unsafe. Something socially negative, insecurity, has created something economically positive for somebody else. Demand. That doesn't mean the security company wants crime. It means the company exists inside an economic relationship where insecurity creates demand. Don't focus only on the person. Look at the incentive. When people depend on the system. Now, make it bigger. Imagine an industry employs 20,000 people. Those workers have families. They buy houses. They shop at local businesses. They pay taxes. Other businesses depend on their spending. Politicians have people whose livelihoods depend on those jobs. And then somebody discovers we have a serious problem with what this industry is doing. Initially, that sounds like a moral question. Should this continue? But almost immediately another question appears. What happens to those 20,000 jobs? That's a legitimate question. Some families didn't necessarily create the problem, but now their economic security is connected to the system producing it. Suddenly, changing the system isn't simply about convincing people that something is wrong. Now you have to figure out what happens to everybody who depends upon it. That's how systems become sticky. History gives us enormous examples. Consider the Atlantic plantation economy. European demand for commodities such as sugar and tobacco generated enormous profits. Plantation economics in the Americas increasingly relied upon the forced labor of enslaved Africans. And the buying, transporting, and exploitation of human beings became interconnected with a much larger Atlantic economy. Think about the system. Plantation owners, merchants, ships, ports, consumers, investors, governments, manufacturers, workers, and enslaved people producing commodities at the center of that economy. Not every person interacting with that system personally captured someone. Not every consumer personally owned an enslaved person. Somebody could simply just be buying some sugar. But the commodity they were consuming could still originate in a system powered by enslaved labor. Now, exploitation isn't happening only through individual cruelty. It has entered the economy. And once something enters an economy, people can become financially connected to it without personally witnessing what is happening at the other end. That's how something morally horrific can become economically ordinary. Now add money to security. Now bring back the security into the equation here. Remember video 2. Group A feels threatened. So Group A increases its military capability. Group B sees that. Group B becomes concerned and increasing its military capability. Group A sees Group B increasing their capability and says, see, that's exactly why we need more weapons. Now add money. Weapons have to be designed, manufactured, transported, maintained, upgraded. People work in those industries. Companies receive contracts. Communities depend upon those jobs. Research gets funded. Politicians represent people employed by those industries. So now the security loop has something else attached to it, an economic engine. Fear creates demand. Demand creates production. Production creates jobs. Production creates profit. Production increases capability. Increased capability can make somebody else feel threatened. Their fear creates more demand. And around we go. A United States president actually warned about this. And not just any president. It was President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Before becoming president, Eisenhower had been a 5-star general and supreme allied commander in Europe during World War II. On January 17th, 1961, at the end of his presidency, Eisenhower delivered his farewell address. He warned the American public about something he called the military-industrial complex. And here's the part people sometimes miss. Eisenhower wasn't arguing that military defense was unnecessary. In the same address, he described a strong military establishment as vital. His concern was what could happen when an enormous permanent military establishment became interconnected with an enormous permanent arms industry. He warned about the possibility of unwarranted influence and misplaced power. He wasn't simply saying weapons are bad. He was saying pay attention to the system created around them. Because you can have legitimate national security concerns, legitimate companies, workers, research, legitimate government contracts, political interests. Connect enough legitimate individual pieces together, and the resulting system can develop incentives that none of those pieces possesses by itself. The square has become the box. That's why we need to follow the incentive. The system doesn't need everyone to be a villain. When studying terrible things in history, we naturally look for the bad guy. And sometimes there is absolutely a bad guy. There are people who knowingly exploit other people. There are people who choose money over human life. There are people who deliberately manipulate systems for their own benefit. But if we stop there, we can miss something even more disturbing. A destructive system doesn't necessarily require every participant to be destructive. It only needs enough participants to benefit from continuing their part of it. Think about that. Because now we're studying some uniquely evil category of human being. We're studying ordinary human incentives. Businesses already understand this. Imagine that I manage a customer service center. I want greater productivity. So I announce whoever completes the most customer calls every month gets a bonus. Seems reasonable. I created an incentive for productivity, except what did I actually measure? Completed calls. One employee realizes, hey, well, if I rush customers off the phone, I can complete twice as many calls. Now customers aren't getting their problem solved. They're calling back. They're getting angry. Customer satisfaction falls. But my spreadsheet says productivity is up. The employee didn't necessarily violate the incentive. They optimized for it. The system doesn't respond to what I meant to reward. It responds to what I actually rewarded. What are we actually rewarding? And that little business example scales into something enormous. Go back to history. If conquest produces land, land produces wealth, wealth produces political power, and political power creates greater ability to conquer. What behavior is being rewarded? If forced labor lowers production costs, lower production costs increases profit. Profit finances expansion, and expansion increases demand for labor. What behavior is being rewarded? If insecurity increases weapons purchases increases production increases jobs and profit, greater military capability frightens other countries, and their fear produces another weapons purchase. What behavior is being rewarded? This does not mean every war is secretly about money. It does not mean every defense company wants war. And economics doesn't explain every historical conflict. Human history is much more complicated than that. I'm asking something narrower. When a harmful condition also produces economic benefits, does that benefit make the condition harder to eliminate? Now look at what happened to our loop. Originally, it was fear, protection, perceived threat, more protection, more fear. But now we added money, fear, protection, demand, profit, greater capability, perceived threat, more fear, more demand, more profit, greater capability, and eventually people can become dependent upon the loop. Now, stopping it isn't simply a question of morality. It's jobs, money, political power, resources, national security, institutions, families, businesses, entire economies. And that's when changing a system becomes incredibly difficult. Because someone can genuinely agree this system needs to change and simultaneously say, but if we change it tomorrow, what happens to me? Both statements can be true. And now we're ready to stop talking theoretically. We're going back several centuries. European powers were expanding Atlantic plantation economies. Those economies demanded enormous amounts of labor. African states and political communities had their own rivalries, wars, economies, security concerns, and trading relationships. European merchants were trading goods into those systems, and among those goods were firearms and ammunition. Meanwhile, European demand for enslaved labor was growing. So now we're going to put everything from our first 3 videos together. You have fear, security, power, demand, profit, incentive, and ask, wait, where did the guns come from? Because what happens when something one person wants for security becomes connected to something another person wants for profit? And that's video 4, firearms, power, and the Atlantic slave trade.